My name is Ashley Hansen. I am currently a 32-year-old housewife. My husband Sean, who is 38 years old, is a mama's boy and verbally abusive. We are a family of 4, including our 10-year-old son and 8-year-old daughter. After getting married, I have been living with my husband's parents, and for several years now, I have been troubled by my mother-in-law's whims. When I talk to my husband about it, he only says, "Just listen to what my mother says." It seems that my mother-in-law thinks of me as a slave she can use freely. She calls me right after waking up saying, "Come wake me up early," and my day starts by pulling her out of bed with my hands. Then I take her to the bathroom, help her change clothes, and then guide her to the living room for breakfast. My mother-in-law is physically disabled and needs my help to move around. Especially in the mornings, it is difficult for her to walk, but by afternoon, her body loosens up a bit, and she can walk slowly. "Hey, bring me some hot tea quickly. I'm done eating." "Yes, the water will boil soon," I reply, only to be yelled at. "Why didn't you boil the water beforehand? You know that I always have tea after meals." "Yesterday," she said, "don't boil the water until I finish eating." It seems that my mother-in-law enjoys making me suffer. I have been married to Sean for 10 years, but his mother's walking difficulties appeared only in the last 5 years, and they seem to be worsening despite hospital visits. I have suggested walking together as a form of rehabilitation, but she does not listen. Before she had difficulty walking, we used to cook and shop together and got along well. Gradually, she became verbally abusive towards me and started treating me like a slave. She used to call me Ash, but now she calls me Hey or Airhead. Despite this, I cared for her and depended on her in the past, so I try to accept the current difficult situation, but I feel sad when I remember how she used to be. Of course, I consult my husband about this every day. However, all he says is, "Just listen to what my mother says," and he does not listen to me at all when I talk about her health condition. Therefore, I record videos as proof that I have informed him whenever something happens so that he cannot say, "I didn't know, I wasn't aware." After a day of being yelled at and following unreasonable orders until my mother-in-law went to bed, a phone call from my sister-in-law made things even worse. "Hey, Susan is coming back home because she's giving birth, so make sure you take care of her properly." I had not even heard that she was pregnant, let alone married, and now she is coming back to give birth. "Mother, when did Susan get married?" "I didn't know about it. I just found out too. But she said she's coming back." "Do you have a problem with what I ordered?" she yelled loudly. From her words, I realized that I was seen only as a slave and as a caretaker for Susan. I judged that asking further would only upset her more, so I just replied, "Yes, I understand," and ended the conversation. When I went out to buy ingredients for dinner and returned home, there were piles of cardboard boxes in front of the entrance. My son ran up to me as if waiting for my return. "Mom, Auntie says she's going to live here, and she says to make my room hers. Do something," he said. Then my daughter also came, running. "They're saying I have to share a room with my brother. We can fit 2 beds, but there's only room for 1 desk," the children said, looking unhappy. I approached my mother-in-law in the living room to verify the situation. "Mother, is what the children told me true?" However, she started talking over me. "Yes, if you heard it from the children, hurry up and move Tom's belongings to Mia's room. And for dinner, Susan wants to eat steak, so prepare that." That's. I heard Susan was coming, but I didn't know about the children's rooms or that dinner would be steak all of a sudden. Then, Susan suddenly started yelling at me. "Hey, Ashley, "You're not in a position to complain to Mom. You're just a parasite. Why are you acting so high and mighty? You should just listen to what Mom says and take care of her," she said, crossing her arms and glaring at me. The children were frightened by Susan's demeanor and hid behind me. "To protect them," I said, "I will discuss this with my husband," and took them to their room. Once we reached the room, the children said, "When is that auntie going back? She's really angry and scary." Even as I was preparing dinner, the children were visibly anxious and didn't want to be left alone, staying close to me. Unable to wait until my husband finished work, I called him. "Did you know that Susan is coming back here to give birth today?" I asked, and he was surprised, not having heard about it either. After explaining the situation and talking about the children, he said, "Mom said to empty one of the children's rooms, right? There's no problem with that. If you have to prepare steak for dinner because Susan wants, just obey Mom. It's natural for Susan to be angry, and you should explain it to the children yourself. But it's impossible to fit 2 beds and a desk in a small room. What are we supposed to do?" "That's not my problem. Figure it out yourself," my husband replied, leaving me feeling hopeless. Seeing my state, my son said, "Mom, it's okay. We just have to endure it," and my daughter also encouraged me. "We can endure it until Auntie leaves. It's all right." Indeed, it's just a matter of enduring until Susan gives birth. It's not like we have to endure forever, as the children have taught me, warming my heart. "Right, we just have to endure until Auntie leaves, but after that, let's return the room to how it was I promised." "I'm sorry for making you endure," I apologized, and the children, who had been looking anxious until now, smiled and said, "Hurry up and make dinner before Auntie gets angry." I then went to the kitchen, took out the meat from the freezer, and started preparing the steak. And not long after, my husband came home in a good mood. In his hand was a box of cake. As dinner time approached, the children came out of their room and were delighted to see the cake box. I thought my husband had bought the cake as an apology for making the children inconvenient and told them, "We'll have the cake after dinner." However, I was mistaken. "This cake is for Susan and Mom," my husband said matter-of-factly. "But why didn't you buy one for the children too? Don't ask such obvious questions." "I bought it because you made Mom and Susan feel bad." My daughter burst into tears, saying, "We haven't done anything wrong," but my husband ignored her and handed the cake to his sister. While holding my crying daughter, I tried to change the subject. "Susan, congratulations on your pregnancy. When is the baby due?" I asked. Laughing, Susan replied, "Ah, thank you. I think it's in October." I was stunned to realize she was only 3 months pregnant and already planning to give birth at home, with the intention of staying here for the entire time. No wonder her stomach wasn't showing at all. Then my mother-in-law asked, "So when are you getting married? What's your partner like?" Susan suddenly panicked and said, "Oh, my partner? Yes, he's the president of a company, and he's really busy right now, so he can't come over. But he's concerned about my health and thinks it's safer for me to be at my parents' house." I thought to myself, Susan is lying, and from her rushed response, there's a high chance that not only the pregnancy but also the marriage might be fabricated. Resolved to uncover the truth, I decided to call Susan's apartment and workplace the next day. After completing my daily routine of caring for my mother-in-law and seeing my husband and children off, I told my mother-in-law I'll be stepping out for a bit and left the house. My first stop was the apartment where Susan used to live. By chance, the janitor was working in front of Susan's room, so I approached him. "Do you know if a person named Susan Hansen lived in this room?" I asked. The janitor replied, Are you an acquaintance of Ms. Hanson? Yes, I couldn't get in touch with her, so I came to check on her, I responded, and he seemed to believe me. Actually, I've also been unable to contact Ms. Hanson. She's half a year behind on rent, and I've been worried she might have collapsed inside, so I was about to unlock the door, he said, asking me to check with him. I readily agreed. Receiving the key from the visibly nervous janitor, I said, "It would be terrible if she had collapsed. I'll go in first, please follow me," and open the door. The entryway was cluttered with envelopes and postcards marked urgent notice. I went in first and called out loudly, "Susan! Susan! Are you there?" As I moved further inside, a man sitting on the sofa, startled by our unexpected entry, exclaimed, "Who are you?" "I'm calling the police," as he reached for his smartphone. The janitor explained, "I am the janitor of this building. We couldn't get in touch with Ms. Hanson, so we entered the room out of concern. We thought she might have collapsed here." He then pressed, "This apartment is for single occupancy, but who are you? We might need to call the police on you." The man, flustered, quickly sat down and introduced himself. "My name is Nick. I am dating Ms. Hanson." Nick explained that Susan told him to wait here until me and the children moved out, since her brother was planning to get a divorce. Susan was plotting to get my husband to divorce me and drive me and the children out of our home. Shocked by this revelation, I struggled to contain my voice and calmed myself. "I am an acquaintance of Susan. I was worried because I couldn't reach her. I heard she was pregnant. Is the child yours?" Nick replied with a look of surprise, "Pregnant." He was in an affair with Susan despite being married, and his divorce had been instigated when his ex-wife discovered the affair. Nick, a candidate for the next president at his father-in-law's company, saw his workplace position jeopardized by the divorce and was forced to resign. Having lost everything, Nick ended up relying on Susan's hospitality. He mentioned having a son from his previous marriage and expressed no intention of having another child with Susan, considering the harm the divorce had caused his son. While cohabitating with Susan, he couldn't stop thinking about his former family and regretted his actions, shedding tears. I wondered why he was sharing such personal information with strangers like us. He revealed that he had been troubled for a long time and wanted to confide in someone. The janitor asked, "Why do you stay with Ms. Hanson indefinitely?" and pointed out that it might be disrespectful to her, and suggested he reconsider his relationship with his former family. After some thought, Nick resolved to make a call, apparently to his ex-wife. He apologized for his mistakes and vowed to live in a way that would make her and his son proud, asking for a chance to prove his changed self. After ending the call, he apologized to us for his past behavior and resolved to start afresh, living independently and striving to be a father his son wouldn't be ashamed of. Finally, he thanked us for helping him see clearly, packed his belongings into a bag and left the room. After he departed, the janitor regretted not asking Nick to contact Susan for him. "Who is Ms. Hanson's guarantor for the rental agreement?" I asked. "Her brother," he replied. I suggested contacting the guarantor, and then I returned home. When I got home, Susan was crying, and my mother-in-law was comforting her. I pretended not to know anything and went to the bedroom to change. Susan entered my room without knocking. "Can you contact my partner using your mobile phone?" "Mine's been blocked and he's rejecting my calls," Susan said, "but I refused to contact a stranger using my account." This incident would later lead to Susan harboring resentment against me. Just as my mother-in-law called for Susan from the living room, Susan glared at me, clicked her tongue, and headed to the living room. Sean told me he got a call from the janitor of your apartment. My mother-in-law was interrogating Susan. Susan, is it true that you've been delinquent on your rent? And there was a man living in your house. Is he your boyfriend? Suddenly, Susan burst into anger. Yes, I came back here intending to start a married life with him. But he wants to go back to his original family, so he left to start over alone. After shouting, she began crying again. Susan's words reached me as I was heading to the living room after changing. I couldn't get in touch with him, so I asked Ashley for help, but she refused. She's just being mean, making sure we can't contact each other, she raged, directing her anger at me. How dare she not listen to my request? She's a parasite, she exclaimed childishly, and I hoped faintly that my mother-in-law would rebuke Susan for her words. I thought so too. That woman, despite being an outsider, doesn't understand her place as a daughter-in-law. She's too impudent. My mother-in-law betrayed even that slight hope. Susan, you are going to live here with him, right? Then that daughter-in-law and her children will have to leave, she said. I had spent so much time catering to my mother-in-law's wishes over my children's. I endured all the sarcasm and abuse, hoping for a return to the enjoyable times I once shared with her. But I realized those days would never come again, and I was deeply disappointed. As I entered the living room, the attacks from my mother-in-law and Susan began. I heard you dared to refuse Susan's request. Didn't I tell you? You are parasites and you don't have the right to refuse? Because you guys didn't leave, he got fed up and left. I recalled my interaction with Nick in my heart. The reason his boyfriend left is because his original family was important to him, right? He chose his original family over Susan. So, it's not my fault. I provoked Susan deliberately. I knew provoking her would make her even more aggressive. It was clear that being called a parasite and making my children feel unwanted would continue. I decided to cut ties with this family. You should call him and say, Susan is crying, or please come back to her. Susan suggested childishly, thinking of naive ways to bring back her lover. Finally reaching my limit with her childish thinking and my mother-in-law's agreement. If that's what you say, then let's do it. Please give me his phone number. Then I called the number Susan gave me on speakerphone. When Nick answered, I relayed Susan's words directly. Susan is very sad since you broke up. She's crying, so please come back to her. Nick replied, I don't know who you are, but I have parted ways with Susan. I love my original family. What I had with Susan was a momentary lapse, and I feel nothing but regret now. Hearing this, Susan went insane and grabbed the phone to start speaking. Nick, what about the child in my stomach? You should take responsibility and marry me, Susan demanded. Susan, it wasn't long ago that I bought you medicine and sanitary products because you had severe menstrual pain. Plus, I never had that kind of relationship with you after the shock of my divorce. When Nick countered her argument, Susan fell silent. Nick apologized. I'm sorry, and hung up. I hoped that now they would understand that Nick left Susan to return to his original family, not because of me, but naturally, that wasn't the case. As soon as the call ended, Susan snapped at me, just because it's none of your business, you didn't speak passionately enough. If you had, he might have come back. Susan started screaming. It's your fault he left, even though she is a 35-year-old adult, 3 years older than me. Faced with accusations that would be typical in a children's quarrel, I was dumbfounded. Hearing Susan's breakdown, my mother-in-law said, That's right. It's all your fault. You're definitely a parasite. Leave this house immediately. As expected, I replied. Understood, and began packing. In the evening, when the children returned from school, I told them, "I'm going to divorce your father and leave this house." After a brief thought, my eldest son smiled and said, "That would be best." My daughters smiled similarly. Grandma and aunt were scary, so I wanted to get away soon. I asked the children, "Will you be okay without your father?" My son answered, "Dad was never on our side or Mom's, so it's okay." My daughter asked, "Are we going to live at your grandma's place on your side?" Just the three of us. It seemed she wasn't concerned about her father at all. Soon after, my husband came home. While I was packing and not greeting him, he entered the room furiously after hearing the story from his mother and sister. Here begins the final scenario I had imagined. "Hey, you upset Mom and Susan. Didn't I tell you to just listen to Mom?" He repeated his usual phrase. "I understand. That's why I'm listening and leaving this house. Also, please sign this." I glared at my husband and spread the divorce papers in front of him. "Where will the 3 parasites go now?" He started signing with ease. "Even if you divorce a jobless parasite like you can't support 2 kids, can you?" he said as he returned to the living room. Then I called my brother and asked, "Could you come with a truck tomorrow morning to pick us up?" I had discussed my mother-in-law and husband's behavior with my brother before, and I had informed him about Susan's sudden arrival. My parents had heard the entire situation from my brother and had advised me to divorce, so the conversation was quick. Over the phone, my brother encouraged me, "Ashley, you've done well so far. Don't blame yourself." I felt somewhat relieved. The next day, my brother and his colleagues came with a truck, and they helped us move our belongings quickly. Susan, who coldly watched the proceedings with crossed arms, barely reacted when I said, "Please take care of your mother." She entered the house expressionlessly. Our new home was in a family-friendly room in a building owned by my father, located right next to my parents' house. Due to a vacancy, we were able to rent it at a low cost. My parents had suggested living together, but after being repeatedly called parasites by my husband's family, I didn't want to impose. The children were thrilled with the new apartment. They had already decided on their own rooms and were happily helping with the unpacking. It was a healing moment to hear their laughter a long time. Then my phone rang. It was my ex-husband sounding frantic. "Mom is in trouble. She's dripping excrement. She's calling for the slave to clean it up, so come quick." "Why should I come?" I responded casually. "Of course you should. Mom said you have to do it. Hurry up. The whole house stinks." As if he had forgotten we were in the process of getting divorced, I replied, "What? I'm a complete stranger now, haha," and he exploded in anger. "After I've taken care of 3 parasites for so long, you can't even do this much." I could endure being called a parasite myself, but I reached my limit when he included the children. "Did you know your mother has dementia?" I've talked about the hospital's diagnosis several times, but you probably didn't listen. I even have video proof. I wouldn't go to your house, where you call my precious children parasites, since it's your beloved mother's smell. Think of it as an air freshener and bear with it. I let it all out in a rush. With my usually quiet and compliant self suddenly changing, my ex-husband was stunned into silence. "Your mother is rated as requiring level 2 care, so she needs help from waking to sleeping. It's tough, but good luck." I hung up and blocked his number. Susan also called, screaming, "Come clean up immediately," but I silently hung up and blocked her too. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at my parents' house from my ex-husband detailing the tragic current situation of his family. Since I left, my mother-in-law, lacking someone to bully, has advanced in her dementia. Susan had returned home under the pretense of being pregnant and wanting to give birth at home just to live comfortably, but my ex blamed Susan for the lack of a caregiver for his mother. They searched for a care facility but only found expensive ones they couldn't afford, so they continued caregiving at home. Susan wanted to return to her previous apartment, but since the guarantor, my ex, had failed to pay the overdue rent and terminated the lease, she had no place to go and had to continue caregiving. Reluctantly, my ex and Susan took care of their mother, constantly fighting over who should do the caregiving. Ironically, although my mother-in-law sometimes forgets who my ex and Susan are, she never forgets to call me the slave. Waking up to the morning sun streaming through the window felt like a blessing for a new start in life for me and the kids. I have a pharmacist's license and hospital experience, but currently work in a drugstore. Returning to society after 10 years is challenging, but any hardship feels minor compared to living with my ex's family. The children quickly made friends at their new school and enjoy their daily routines. Above all, I am grateful that we can spend our days smiling as a family.